Okay, so for our review session this afternoon, I do not have anything planned. So please bring your questions, bring your comments. If there's problems you've worked at the end of the chapter that you're not sure about the answer, anything that you can bring to the review session, please do. It's basically a question and answer time. So if you don't have any questions, then we will have a short review session. But if you have longer questions, then I'm happy to get your questions answered this afternoon. And so that will be the main thing that we talk about this afternoon. And then tomorrow we will take your exam. We will take it in the morning. Okay, we're going to take your exam in the morning. And I'll have more to say about the format of the exam this afternoon. But for right now, the main thing I want to say about the exam is it's going to cover all the material that we covered last week. Okay, and so that is primarily supply and demand from chapter 3, comparative advantage from those 5 or 6 pages in chapter 2, GDP and inflation from chapter 7, unemployment and inflation from chapter 8, and then savings, investment, and financial systems from chapter 10. So that will be your exam tomorrow. Once again, it will not cover what we talk about today. And so that's plenty of material. Trust me, that's plenty of material. And if you spend some time this weekend, you probably agree with me that we actually covered a fair amount of material last week. And so, that will be what's covered on the exam. So, all right. So does anybody have any questions about the exam? Like I said, we're going to have a lot more time to talk about it this afternoon. But if anybody has got some questions right now that they want to ask, or
do you have like a ballpark like question number? Like how many questions do you think will be on there?
not.
Or can you not say that?
I mean, so first off, the kind of questions that are going to be on your quiz or your exam are more like the questions you see in your quiz, right? Kind of a question of short answers, definitions, problems. I don't really have so much to say about the numbers, but I would say that I've kind of have in mind for the exam to take about an hour and a half. And so, and between an hour and a half and 2 hours. Somebody asked in the chat, are we going to do Google Forms? I don't think I'm going to do Google Forms. I think what I'm going to do, I'm pretty sure what I'm going to do is I'm just going to send you via email a Microsoft document, a Microsoft document file, Word file, and then you're just going to be able to type your answers into that. Or if you want to put pictures, you can just put your pictures into the Word file and send it back to me. Okay, I think it will actually, given the number of questions that this is longer, I think Forms is actually, for me, it's working okay, but I think it's probably going to be better for these shorter quizzes. For a longer exam, I think I'd prefer to just do it via email and do it in Word. Okay, and so I'll talk about this a little bit this afternoon, but I will send you a Word file, and I'm going to request that you send me back a Word file, right? Don't send me back a PDF or don't send me back a Google Doc. Primarily because particularly PDFs are very difficult to provide comments on, right? There's not a really good function for me providing commentary on your exam. So, all right. Anything else quick? Like I said, we got a lot of time this afternoon to talk about the exam, so we can save the rest of our discussion for that. Okay, well, what are we going to talk about this morning? I think this morning's class should be an interesting one because we're really this morning going to focus on that first question, right, from our syllabus. If you remember on day 1, we talked about the 6 big questions that we talk about in macroeconomics. And that first big question is, why are rich countries rich? And poor countries poor? And related to that, why are there big differences in growth rates? Between countries. we see not just big differences in the level of income between countries, but we see big differences in the growth rates between countries. So I think I told you that Ethiopia has a per capita GDP that is about 1/90th of what the United States is, right? So what that basically means is that an American can earn in a day what it takes an Ethiopian worker to earn in about 3 months, right? 2.5 to 3 months. That is a big difference in income levels. But then there's also very big differences in growth rates. In other words, how quickly those income levels are going up. As we're going to see, there actually are poor countries but are growing fast. But we also have poor countries that are growing slow. We have rich countries that are growing relatively fast, and then we have some rich countries that are growing slow. So if you think about growth rates as being looking toward the future about what's going to be happening to income levels in the future, all this disparity is just quite an interesting topic, right? It's quite an interesting set of questions here. And so that's really what we want to talk about in chapter 9, is to think about, why is this? Why are rich countries rich, poor countries poor? Why do we see big differences in growth rates between countries? If you think about the United States, probably the most important single fact about our history as a country is our extended and sustained level of economic growth, right? That is probably the most important single fact about this country, is that somehow we have been able to sustain economic growth throughout almost all of our history. And so what that means is that we have incredible changes in standards of living, right? If we went back to the year 1900, life expectancy in the United States was 47 years. Today, it's 78 years, right? We've extended our life expectancy by about 30 years over the last 120 years. Per capita GDP back in 1900 was about $5,000 a person. Today, we're roughly $60,000 a person in real terms. So in other words, we've seen our standards of living rise by about 12 times over the last 120 years. Back in 1900, we had an infant mortality rate of 14%, right? 14% of all babies died. Today, that number is less than 1%. So all of these are just incredible facts that basically shape every aspect of our lives, right? The fact that we have become so much richer as a country has shaped every aspect of our life. For the good, right? In terms of the fact that, having higher standards of living mean that we have a lot of comforts, we have higher life expectancy, life is in many ways easier. And then of course, for the bad in some ways, particularly when you think about two things that we will talk about some over the next couple of days. One of those is the environmental impact of economic growth, right? That has definitely played a negative role in our lives. I'm going to argue on Wednesday that another thing that's playing a negative role in our lives is economic inequality. That it doesn't just matter how rich we are, but also how rich we are relative to other people matters. And so the fact that we've had big increases in economic inequality is a negative aspect of this growth, right? And so while growth hasn't been all good, it certainly has not been all bad, right? And in fact, I would argue that even with this inequality, the benefits of growth far outweigh its costs, but we have to be cognizant of the cost of growth as well. And we will definitely talk about those over the next couple of days. This question about growth has always been at the center of economics, right? And we've talked a couple times about Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. And as you can tell from the title, that book, The Wealth of Nations, was really asking this question: why are rich countries rich and poor countries poor? In many senses, these are the questions that started economics as a discipline, right? That started smart people thinking about, well, why exactly is this, right? Why is it that England is 50% richer than France, and France is a third richer than Spain, right? Why is that, right? How do we help understand that? Let's talk just a little bit about the data of economic growth. Right? In other words, let's just talk about a couple of facts. Right? The first fact, undoubtedly, is that there is huge variation in income or GDP levels across countries. Right? Huge variation in income levels across countries. As I said, you know, in the US, per capita GDP is roughly about $60,000. If we look to sub-Saharan Africa, which we're going to talk about, sub-Saharan Africa is really just cutting off the top of Northern Africa and talking about everything kind of below Northern Africa. What we see is that average per capita income is about $1,500 or less. Some countries in the $500 to $600 range of annual per capita income, right? Incredible variations in income levels between countries. If you want to get a rough idea about where poverty is, you can take a look at this graph. This just gives you a rough idea where the countries that are in purple have high income, the countries in yellow have low income, right? In fact, these are the countries in yellow have per capita income under $1,000. So to put that in some perspective, their average income is less than what, $3 a day. It's like $2.50 a day, right? The average person is living on about $2.50 a day in income, right? That gives you some perspective about just how low some of these numbers are. So you see, a lot of poverty in sub-Saharan Africa, but in general, one of the interesting things that we see here is that the tropics tend to be a center of poverty. The tropics meaning that area around the equator, right? So we tend to see more poverty in the tropics. We tend to see less poverty in more temperate regions. We'll actually talk about that as we go along. You might think, well, does it have something to do with the weather? Maybe, but I think there's actually some other factors going into this, right? That we'll have to talk about. Now, one of the things to note, though, is that it has not always been like this. It hasn't always been the case that the countries in the tropics were richer than elsewhere. Here's a little graph. This graph has broken the world into two big groups. Developed countries today, meaning rich countries today, and underdeveloped or less rich countries today. If we took those two groups, right, the rich countries today and the poor countries today, if we took those two groups and took them all the way back to the year 1000, what would we see? There was almost no difference in income levels between the rich and the poor countries. In fact, the two richest countries, let me ask you, history buffs, what were the two richest regions of the world in the year 1000? Any ideas? China. Oh, I see somebody popping in the chat here. Hold on. Someone says Greece, the Roman Empire. No, those are long gone, right? Or getting to be long gone. Asia, yeah. China, the Middle East, India, right? Those are some of the richest regions of the world, which shows you how much the world is actually changed, right? And I mean, as one of the things we're going to talk about going on is that being rich is not necessarily predetermined. Countries do go from being rich to poor and vice versa. But as we look at these groups of countries here over time, what do we see? Today's developed countries begin to start to pull ahead, particularly the Industrial Revolution, right? It's that period of time in the late 1700s where today's rich countries begin to pull ahead, right? During the Industrial Revolution in the late 1700s. But I want to make a clear point from this graph. When we begin to see inequality, it wasn't that the poor countries got poor, right? You notice here at these white bars, the white bars have gone up, right? The poor world has gotten richer. They just have not gotten rich as quick as the rich world has gotten richer, okay? So yes, the entire globe has gotten richer, but we have seen inequality because the rich world has gotten richer at a much faster rate than the poor world, right? And so this leads in some sense to that citizenship premium that we've talked about, right? And we've talked about this a number of times in this class, but I'll just refer to it again. That where you live matters. In fact, if we actually look at the data, 80% of income differences across people, across individual people, is explained by one fact: where you live. That's pretty amazing, right? That is a pretty amazing fact. That I basically know 80% of what your income is going to be if I know the answer to one simple question: where do you live? Right? And so for those of us who are Americans, we were in many ways born into the jackpot, right? That we are likely destined to be amongst the rich, the global rich, right? The global rich, simply by the fact that we live here. And so we've talked about the citizenship premium again and again in this class. And I think the last time we talked about it last week when we talked about the incentives for migration, right? This creates a huge incentive for people to migrate to the US. And it also creates a huge incentive for improving global welfare, because what it means is that when people migrate to the US, they become much richer, in part because, as we're going to see, they become much more productive, right? They become much more productive. So this is just looking at differences in income. I should say that remember that wealth is different from income. Right? Wealth is basically your accumulated income minus your accumulated spending. And there is greater variations in wealth than there is income. So if we look not just the income, meaning year to year, but we look at the accumulated income over time, we see that there's even bigger variations. The 28 richest people in the world own more wealth than the poorest 50% of the global population. which is about 3.5 billion people, right? I mean, there's a number of facts that I could try to express this inequality to you, but this is maybe one of the more shocking. 28 people own more than 3.5 billion people, right? It's actually, when you begin to talk about some of these inequality figures, they're really so big that it's almost impossible to put your mind around them, right? It's hard to imagine a world in which 28 people own more than 3.5 billion people. 28 people have more wealth than a population of basically India, China, the United States, and Europe. It's just hard to wrap your mind around, right? It's just hard to wrap your mind around. And so, yes, there is incredible inequality, right? Incredible inequality across countries. Now, as I said a minute ago, though, there's another important fact that we need to keep separate from the first fact. The first fact is dealing with income levels. But the second fact is that there's also big differences in growth rates. Across countries. I don't know why I'm spelling big with 2 G's. Right. There's big differences in growth rates across countries. And what this means is that you have the possibility of what we call growth miracles, where countries catch up to rich countries. But then we also have growth disasters. Where countries fall behind other rich countries. So let's just look at, once again, a little bit of data here, a few figures to try to see what's happening. So here we have 3 countries, the United States, China, and India. First, notice that there's big differences in income levels between the US and China and India, right? Even today, there are still big differences in income levels between the 3 countries, right? If we're looking at per capita terms. However, we see, some different stories here. Notice that since about 1980, China has grown much faster than the United States. And so what does that mean? China's catching up, right? And we often refer to this as a growth miracle, though I don't really love this term growth miracle because it kind of suggests that it's impossible to explain. I think we will explain, right, why China is growing a lot faster than the United States as we go along. But yeah, China's grown a lot faster. And so China's been able to catch up. India has grown slightly faster than the United States, but you can see their rate of catch up is lower. And what's happened between China and India is that there's actually divergence between those 2 income levels. In other words, they're getting farther apart because China is not only richer, but it's also growing faster, okay? So you might say that we have convergence between the US and China and the US and India, but we have divergence between China and India, right? And all this has to do with both the levels of income, but also the growth rates. Now, whenever we talk about growth rates of income, the most important thing to understand is the power of compounding.
Oh, we're still looking at the screen with the graph.
Yep, sorry. Okay, the key idea here is because of compounding, small differences in income growth rates lead to big differences in income levels over time. Small differences in income growth rates lead to big differences in income levels over time. Okay? Hopefully we all know what compounding is, right? The fact that when you have growth, it increases the level, but then that level also grows, which leads to further increases in the level, right? Compounding is the reason why population levels have expanded over time, right? Because babies grow up and then they have babies. And then those babies grow up and have babies, right? So you have this compounding effect. Compounding is also the reason why if you put money in the bank at 5% and you leave it there for 20 years, you're going to have a lot of money at the end of it. Because it's not just the money you originally put in the bank that earns interest, but it's also your interest that earns interest, okay? Compounding is one of the most powerful ideas in economics and finance and business, right? I mean, so many things are really impossible to understand without understanding the power of compounding. And certainly, how countries get rich, you have to understand the power of compounding. Maybe the best way to kind of illustrate this is something that I know that many of you are first year students, and so this is something that we talked about in the first year seminar, the rule of 70, right? And if you didn't like talking about it in the first year seminar, you have me to blame because I'm the reason why everybody talked about this in the first year seminar. And damn it, we're going to talk about it again here, right? The rule of 70. Anybody remember what the rule of 70 was from the first year seminar? I know that seems so far away from today. That was like 7 blocks ago. That was like a lifetime. Remember? Right? So the rule of 70 says, if something grows at G% a year, it will double in size it will double in size every 70 divided by G years. Okay. So if something grows at G% a year, it will double in size every 70 divided by G years. Okay, why is it the rule of 70 and not the rule of 100? For instance, if something's growing at 1%, how long will it take to double? 100 years?
70.
70 years, not 100. Why not 100, Zach?
Because of compounding.
Because of compounding, right? That interest will grow, earn interest, right? And so the fact that this is a rule of 70 tells you the power of compounding, right? Is that there's a big difference between 70 and 100. If something's growing at 1% a year, it will double in size every 70 years. If it's growing at 2% a year, how long will it take to double in size? 35 years, right? If it's growing at 3% a year, how long will it take to double in size? You know, about 21 years. Wait, am I doing my math wrong? No, 17 years, right? So what you can see here is that small differences in the growth rate can lead to big differences in income levels if given enough time. So let's think about this just in a simple example. The US and Argentina. Let's think about a world, and this is not an imaginary world, where the US was as rich as Argentina. And as I said, this is not an imaginary world. If you go back to the mid 1800s, the US was roughly about as rich as Argentina. In fact, for many immigrants, this was actually a huge decision. Am I going to migrate to the US or am I going to migrate to Argentina? Right? I mean, if you've ever been to Argentina, you'll see that there's a huge, I wouldn't say just huge population of European descent. Almost everybody in Argentina is of European descent, right? And so largely because of immigration rates that were very close to what immigration rates in the US were in the early to mid 1800s. So the US and Argentina were roughly about as rich as each other. And just to kind of pick a number here, let's say that they both had a per capita GDP of about $4,000. That's probably a little high, but we're just going to use this as a number, okay? But here's the difference. What's happened since the 1800s? Well, the US has been growing at about 2% a year in real terms. But what about Argentina? It's been growing at about 1% in real terms. Roughly. So what does this mean? Well, let's say that this is back here in, I don't know, let's just pick a date. We'll say this is roughly 1850. By the way, these numbers are all kind of just rough. Where were these countries by 1920? In the 70 years between 1850 and 1920, what has happened to Argentina's income? They're growing at 1% a year, remember. What's happened?
Yeah, it's doubled once, yeah?
It's doubled once. $8,000. But what's happened to the US?
It's doubled twice.
It's doubled twice. What happens if we go out here to 1970? What's happened to Argentina? They've doubled once again in those 70 years. What's happened to the US? They doubled once. They've doubled twice.
Right to 1990, yeah?
To 1990, thank you. Yeah, not 1970. Yeah, 1990. And so what do you see here? What seems to be a small difference in growth rates leads to a huge difference in levels over time because of the power of compounding. This is really how rich countries get rich. You don't have to grow at 10% a year to get rich. You just have to grow and sustain it over a long period of time. And in fact, in many ways, that is the strength of the US economic history. Is one of the things that we've seen in the US is it's not like the US has ever grown at 12% a year. One of the remarkable things about the US is that we just have grown pretty steadily year after year after year. And in part because we've had a number of advantages. For instance, there's never been a real, other than the Civil War, we haven't had a world war or anything fought on US soil, right? Something that would really knock your economy back. This is something that's knocked back a lot of European countries, right? And then they've had to catch up again. We won't go into why growth in the US has been so steady, but it has, right? And that's been one of the real strengths of the US economy is that we've actually just been able to, in general, grow steadily year after year after year after year. And so you can see how these translate into big differences in income levels over time. So, you look here, what's happened between 1980 and 2018, and you can see the countries that are basically catching up with the US and the countries that are falling behind. You have China and India, which are catching up at a pretty quick rate. Of course, remember, it's going to take them a while to catch up, right? Because they started off far behind. And by the way, when you see these numbers of growth in China at 7 or 8%, you have to take those very skeptically, quite honestly. I mean, most of the data that comes from China, you have to use as an approximate number, right? It's not particularly reliable. But you see other countries that have done very well here, like Ireland and Bangladesh. And then you've seen countries that have not done as well as the US, France, and then of course down here at Argentina, right? In Argentina, I'll talk a lot about Argentina here today and on Wednesday, because Argentina is really a nice comparison to the US. In many ways, Argentina should be as rich as the United States, right? In fact, if you've ever been to Argentina, really, Argentina kind of, from a geographic perspective, looks a lot like the US. It feels a lot like the US. It had a bunch of European immigrants in the early mid-1800s. It had a lot of the factors that we see in American history, and yet it's been the US that has grown and Argentina that's largely not grown. And so it's kind of an interesting case study. But the key here, once again, is you don't have to grow fast. Even small differences in growth rates can lead to big differences in levels over time, right? That's the key takeaway. Okay, so those are just a couple of facts that I think we should all be familiar with. Now let's get into what we'll call the nitty-gritty, right? The real question of how do we explain all this? Okay, how do we explain these differences in income levels and growth rates? So here's the big question, right? Here's the billion-dollar question, trillion-dollar question, as it might be. How do we explain these differences in income levels and growth rates? So I want to kind of take I'll call this a staged approach to answering this question. In other words, I'm going to give you a simple answer, but then we're going to dig down into that simple answer and try to think a little bit more deeply about why that simple answer by itself is not completely persuasive, right? Or I shouldn't say persuasive, but it doesn't give us the full picture of what's going on. There actually is a simple answer to this question, right? How do we explain these differences in income levels and growth rates between countries? Simple answer is a simple one. All these differences are explained by differences in productivity. Differences in productivity. How much we make. Economists define productivity as essentially the amount of goods and services produced by an average worker in an hour of time. In other words, how much a worker makes per hour is how economists define productivity. Okay. Productivity is the key to getting rich, right? How is it that Americans earn higher income? Because we produce more goods and services, right? I know that sounds like a simple answer, but it's the truth. we're able to produce more goods and services in an hour's worth of time. Why do we define this as an hour's worth of time? Well, it's really the recognition that how much you work can't explain all this difference, right? There's no way that you can explain the fact that the US is richer because we work more. And the reason is there's just simply not enough hours in a day to explain that variation. And plus, we also know that's not the truth, right? If you actually look at the number of hours spent working, people in poor countries actually work more than people in rich countries in terms of the hours spent, right? So the difference, the reason why the US is richer, the average American is richer than the average Ethiopian, gets down to this question of productivity. The average US worker can produce much more goods and services in an hour's worth of time than the average Ethiopian, right? Now, how do we explain this? The next question then is, well, okay, that's a simple answer, but then we need to take this different. We need to take this deeper. What determines productivity? If it's productivity that matters, what then determines productivity? And here, there's three things. The big three. Right? You'll hear me talk a lot about the big three here over the course of the rest of the block. What's the big three? The big three are the three things that determine productivity. And quite honestly, I don't think any of these are a big shock to you. But let me ask you, what do you think is important in determining how productive a worker is? Right? What factors are most important to determining how productive a worker is? Anybody have any ideas? Sunny says technology. Absolutely. I'm going to come back.
Sorry.
No, jump in there. Were you going to say, Zach?
I was going to say like maybe the safety of the work environment, or like, I don't know. That's just.
Yeah, I think that's like too low level, right? Quality of healthcare. Well, I mean, I'm not saying these things aren't important, but we're talking about big picture. What are the most important things that make you productive?
Personal health. I mean, like, if you're not healthy, then you can't, like.
Yeah. I hate to say competition. I think you are, like, at some level, incentives. Yes, well, you're getting like these are the big three, not the detailed three, right?
How much is like invested in infrastructure and education?
Yeah, capital, right? Physical capital. The tools you have to work with, right? The tools you have to work with. And then the third thing is probably so obvious that we can't think of it. What are we doing right now? Ryan says human capital. Yes. Education. There's physical capital, but then there's human capital, meaning investment in people, our knowledge. Okay. Let's talk about each of these individually, and just to be clear that we know what we're talking about when we talk about these things. What is human capital? Human capital is more broad than education. Of course, education is a big part of human capital, but you also have to think about human capital as more than that. It can be experience. It can be, for lack of a better word, just simple know-how, right? Figuring things out. We're actually going to, well, I won't get into that right now, right? But yeah, simple know-how. So if you think about an hour's worth of work, that hour's worth of work is going to be more valuable the more human capital is invested in the person that's doing the work, right? So I've had roofers up on my house for the last couple of weeks, right? How productive would I have been up there if I was the guy up there on the roof? Not very productive, because I don't know anything about how to put a roof on, right? So could I have figured it out? Maybe, but it would have taken me a lot longer than it took the guys up there, because they know what they're doing. And that's just, I mean, that's simple. That's obvious, right? Physical capital is just tools, right? All the tools, the physical tools that we use in our jobs. And sometimes the not so physical tools, right? Such as Zoom, right? Which is a tool, though it doesn't necessarily have to be something that you can touch. And then there's technology, and this is the one that's probably the hardest to understand. Technology is really how we use inputs to get output. It's the way that we put inputs together to get output. So think about technology as the way that we take physical capital and human capital and we put it together to make something. Technology really incorporates a lot of things. It includes, of course, invention, meaning completely new ideas. But as a practical matter, invention is probably a pretty small idea of technology, quite honestly. Most technology is more focused on innovation, which is basically using existing ideas in a different way. And just as importantly, technology is about organization. How exactly you organize the means of production. So, you think about, I think most of the time when we think about technology, we think about, somebody inventing a new, faster computer chip. And that is a form of technology, right? That is a form of technology. But in general, most technology is much more mundane than that. It's something like Henry Ford's assembly line, right? Henry Ford had a relatively simple idea. Instead of having the cars in one place and moving the people around, how about we keep the people in one place and move the cars around? That doesn't sound like that radical of an idea, but that change in the way you organize production had huge increases in productivity. People were much more productive when they didn't have to move around and they could focus on doing one job. And so those are the kind of ideas that fuel technology over time. Okay, we're going to talk about these three things here more in a second. But these are the big three. These are the big three, right? These are the three things that make rich countries rich. And these are the three things that increase productivity. Now, I'm a little surprised that nobody said one thing, because usually when I ask this question, like, what are the things that increase productivity? Usually somebody says, well, natural resources, having natural resources. Does having natural resources make you rich? The simple answer is no, period. No. And so we're going to have to go a little bit further in our discussion here and circle back to this about why this is a no. But as we're going to see, if you look across the globe, there is really no correlation between having natural resources and being rich. In fact, What's one of the most resource-laden countries in the world? The Congo, the poorest country in the world, is also one of the most natural resource-laden countries in the world. Having resources by itself does not make you rich, right? And we're going to have to talk about why that is. But this is an idea, a bad idea, one of those bad ideas that has constantly percolated in many intelligent people's thinking about growth through the years. So as a bit of an aside here, I want to talk about an economist by the name of Thomas Malthus. Okay. So, good old Thomas Malthus. Who is Thomas Malthus? So Thomas Malthus lived in England, and he was a minister. He lived in England in the late 1700s. He was roughly a compatriot of Adam Smith. And so in 1780, he wrote a book called an essay on the principle of population. The principle of population. And so Malthus is a really important intellectual figure in not just economics, but really in many different disciplines for a number of reasons. First off, he was really the father of demographics. So he was really one of the first people to ask the question, well, what's happening to population growth in England? And so Malthus traveled around and collected information on population growth. And so what did Malthus observe? Well, he observed a couple of things in the late 1700s. He documented that population in England was growing. But the amount of land is fixed. And then he also documented that the land per person determines productivity and income. These are the things that Malthus observed. The population was growing, the amount of land is fixed, and the amount of land per person determines your productivity and income. Why did Malthus observe this number 3? Well, in the late 1700s, what did most people in England do as a job? Yeah, Sonny says an agricultural economy. Yeah, 97% of English people at this time were farmers. Remember, this is really right at the cusp of the Industrial Revolution, right? So the Industrial Revolution is just starting to take place. And so Malthus says, listen, population's going up, but land is fixed. And how rich we are and how productive we are depends upon the amount of land. So you can kind of see where Malthus thought this was headed. As the population goes up, what's going to happen to the land per person ratio?
It's going to go down.
It's going to go down. And what's going to happen to our productivity? It's going to go down. And what's going to happen to our income? It's going to go down. And in fact, if income falls far enough, what starts to happen? I mean, you simply have too many people for the amount of land you have, right? You're going to have famine and huge drops in the population. But there's an upside to famine. We usually don't think about it that way, but what's the upside to famine? What happens as the population falls? Your land to population ratio goes up. Your productivity goes up. And what happens when your income goes up and you're starting to feel healthy? Well, as people have more to eat and they feel healthy, they start making babies. And we just keep on repeating the circle. Okay. And so when people read Malthus's book, one reviewer said, if this is economics, then economics is truly a dismal science, right? Because this is a pretty dismal view of the world. And that moniker of economics as the dismal science is really kind of hung around, right? Some of you might have heard this phrase referred to economics as the dismal science. And yeah, right? This is a pretty dismal view of the future. What did Malthus miss?
Technology.
Technology, undoubtedly, right? This idea that in the future we could innovate by thinking about, for instance, different varieties of crops, fertilizers, different techniques. Of course, technology also has led to different forms of capital other than land, right? In Malthus's time, the main form of capital was land. Today, you know, what's the main form of capital? If I asked you to tell me all the different types of capital, you'd probably talk for a while before you got down the land, right? Your phone, right? There's millions of different types of capital. And so it just goes to show you how important physical capital, human capital, and technology are. But what's not so important? Natural resources. And we're going to, once again, come back and talk about this a little bit later. But natural resources are not the most important thing. And you still see this kind of idea, or what we'll call Malthusian thinking. Right? This kind of Malthusian thinking is still prevalent today. During break, do a Google search on the population bomb. People talking about how there's no way that our economy can survive now that once we get to 8 billion people. Of course, people were saying that when we had 3 billion people, there's no way the economy can survive when we moved to 4 billion people. Now we're at 7 billion people, and now it's 8, right? Going toward 8. This idea that somehow we can't support this number of people is, you know, I think a very common one. Or this idea that there are natural limits to growth. And as we're going to talk about after break, you know, there are, at least to this point, we have not found any natural limits to growth because in essence, we haven't found any limit to our creativity. As long as we can continue to create and innovate, there's still going to be the potential for growth. And that's one of the remarkable things that our economy has shown us over the last 40 to 50 years, right? Is that we have been able to innovate all sorts of new things to want, right? And so now as we eat, you know, and now as only 2 or 3% of our population is farmers, I think if I told you in 1900 that only 3% of people were going to be farmers, many of you would say, oh my God, everybody else is going to starve because what else are they going to do? Well, you could have never foreseen the things that people do now, right? I mean, part of technology is not just innovating in terms of how we produce, it's innovating in terms of what we want, right? The things that we want. And so we've been able to figure out a lot of things that now we need and how to make those things, right? That's part of an evolutionary economy. And so, I talk about this Malthusian thinking because, pay attention to this, right? When you hear a lot of people who are not economists talk about growth and the future of growth, a lot of times you'll hear kind of this Malthusian thinking kind of seep in to how they talk about these things. Okay, this would be a good time for a break. Okay, so let's take a break and maybe meet back here at 10:10, okay? All right, see you in a few minutes. All right, folks. Okay, so before break, we were talking about the big three here. Physical capital, human capital, technology. Which is most important? Which of these three is most important? I'm going to make an argument, not just an argument, but try to support it with data. Technology is the most important part of this. It's technology. Human capital and physical capital are important, but they have a particular problem. Physical capital and human capital have physical limits to them in ways that we're going to talk about here in a minute. For instance, one of the limits to human capital is that simply there's only 24 hours a day and we don't live forever. Could a person spend 70 years accumulating human capital? Well, I guess they could, but they're going to have very few working years to actually use it, right? So there are limits to how much human capital people can have, at least in terms of the hours spent on education. Likewise, there's some pretty big limits to physical capital that we're going to talk about here in a minute, to accumulating physical capital. The beautiful thing about technology is that in theory, it can grow without end. It's not subject to the same physical limitations. But before we talk about the data here, I want to talk about the limits to growth through physical capital alone. Okay. In the 1960s and 1970s, there was a strong belief in what could be called capital-led development strategies. This kind of strong belief among many economists, and sometimes not economists, quite honestly, who said, well, why are poor countries poor? They don't have capital. And so what should we do? We should help poor countries become rich by going in and giving them capital. Let's help them build roads, build bridges, build dams, give them money to build these things. And then once they build them, then things will be great, right? Give them all the capital that they need. And once you have that capital, you'll grow faster. All right, well, it's a nice idea, right? It's a nice idea, But one of the problems with capital-led development is it really fundamentally misunderstands a very simple idea in economics, which is the idea of diminishing marginal returns. Understanding diminishing marginal returns, I'm gonna put a little star here, because understanding diminishing marginal returns is one of those things that that allow you to think like an economist, right? Understanding diminishing marginal returns is where economists think like economists, right? In other words, we think a little bit more critically about the world than many people do. And part of it is understanding concepts like diminishing marginal returns. So let me explain to you what diminishing marginal returns is, and then I'm going to explain how it kind of prevents or frustrated these capital-led development strategies from being successful. So let's think about an aggregate production function. Okay. Think about a function here. Now we're going to talk about a mathematical function, and I'm not going to put any specific formula here. But I'm just going to say, imagine a function like this, where y is output, and output is a function of k, which is physical capital, and h, which is human capital. All right? So in other words, we take human capital, we take physical capital, and we combine it to get output. And where's technology here? Well, you can think about technology as the function itself. Right? Because remember, how did we define technology? It's the way we take inputs to make output. So technology is the function itself. It's the way that we combine these two inputs to make output. This is what we could call a production function, right? An aggregate production function. And as I said, I'm not going to give you a specific formula. For those of you who take more economics classes, we'll talk about specific production functions, right? We'll try to be a little bit more specific here. But for this class, we just want to kind of talk about this idea in general, right? That you can take inputs and you use technology then to turn it into output, right? Or aggregate income. Now, if I graphed this production function, and I held technology and human capital constant, and I just thought about what the relationship is between aggregate output and physical capital. What does this relationship look like? If I increase physical capital, should output go up? Yes. But should it go up at a constant rate? The insight from economics is no, it should not go up at a constant rate. And in fact, it should look like something like this. It goes up, but at a diminishing rate. And this is what diminishing marginal returns is. As the quantity of capital rises, the change in output from an additional unit of capital falls. Right? As the quantity of capital rises, the change in output from an additional unit of capital falls. Okay. All right. This, quite honestly, is a bit of a tricky definition here because we're using some words very exactly, right? We have to use some words very exactly to convey the true importance of what we're talking about. So as the quantity of capital rises, the change in output from an additional unit of capital falls. That's what's captured here in this graph. So what are we saying? Let's think about two countries. One country is poor and they have very low level of capital. One country is rich and they have a very high level of capital. Okay? So this country has a low level of income. This country is going to have a high level of income. But here's the deeper idea. What happens if I give 1 unit of capital to each of these countries? I give 1 more unit of capital to each of these countries. What's going to happen to the change in output for the poor country? It's going to be pretty big. What's going to be the change in output for the rich country? It's going to be smaller, much smaller. In other words, capital becomes less of a driver for growth the richer you become. So I'm going to write this implication down here. Capital becomes less important to growth the richer you are. Why? Because of diminishing marginal returns. I want to make sure we understand what's the intuition behind why this occurs, right? Why does diminishing margin returns actually hold? So I guess to understand it, let me give you just, this is kind of a ridiculous example, but hopefully it illustrates something. So let's say that I went and bought 50 acres, okay? Bought 50 acres and I am going to farm it, okay? So I buy my 50 acres, it's just me and my human capital. I go out on the land and the first day I just start digging around in the dirt with my hands. How productive am I going to be? Pretty unproductive, right? Pretty unproductive. My productivity is going to be low. So at the end of the first day, I figure this out. It takes me a day to figure this out. I go down to the hardware store and I buy a shovel. What's happened to my productivity? It's gone up a lot, right? And then I go and I buy a rake. My productivity goes up a lot. Then I kind of get smart. It's like, hey, maybe I should go buy a tractor. What happens when I buy that tractor? My productivity is going up a lot, right? When I started at low levels of capital and added a little capital, what's going to happen to my productivity and my output? It's going to go up by a lot, right? So when I buy that tractor, I'm a lot more productive. What happens if I decide I want to buy a combine then? Well, a combine on just 50 acres, I mean, yeah, it's going to make me more productive, certainly, but it's not going to be nearly as productive as that tractor was. What happens if I buy a tractor and a combine and I decide, I really love buying stuff. I'm going to buy a second tractor. How productive is that second tractor going to be? Not nearly so productive, right? And how about that second combine? Not nearly so productive. In other words, as I get more and more capital, what starts to happen to the productivity of these additional units? They really start to diminish, right? I mean, you do the most productive stuff first, the easy stuff, but after you've done that, right, the productivity gains that you get from adding more and more capital really start to diminish. And that is what diminishing margin returns is all about. Can you increase output by increasing capital? Yes, but only to a point. Only to a point. As you become richer and richer, capital becomes less important to growth the richer you are. So that is a really, really important implication. Something that people don't, once again, tend to understand, right? People, I think the layperson, right, the person who's not familiar with economics says, well, why does the US become rich? Because we invest in physical capital. Yes, that is part of it, but that can't be the only thing. It can't be the only thing, particularly for a rich country like the US. Here's another implication. Oops. This one is maybe even more surprising. Ceteris paribus, meaning all else being equal, poor countries should grow blank than rich countries. Your choices here are faster or slower. Everything else being equal, poor countries should grow faster than rich countries or slower. Faith says faster, question mark. Faith, where's the courage of your convictions? No question mark. True. Everything else being equal, poor countries should grow faster than rich countries. Why? Diminishing margin returns, right? Poor countries can actually grow quite fast if they can accumulate investment. If they can get some physical capital, they can grow quite fast. So just like my farm could have big increases in productivity when I bought a shovel or when I bought a tractor, yes, poor countries actually have more room to grow faster than rich countries because they are so starved for capital that any capital is likely to have big improvements in their productivity. However, this then leads to the third, which is that what should happen to your growth as you become richer? It should slow down. Growth should slow as a country gets richer. Once again, ceteris paribus, meaning everything else being equal. And of course, this is not always the case. Not everything always is equal. But everything else being equal, growth in a country should slow down as it gets richer. Okay, so understanding diminishing marginal returns gives you some insight, once again, into the stupid things that you hear politicians or other people say about economics and what's happening in other countries, such as a country like China, right? Why is China growing so fast? Why have they grown so fast over the last 40 to 50 years? In part because they were so poor in 1980, right? China was amongst the poorest countries in the world. And so when they started to grow, they were able to grow extremely fast because of diminishing marginal returns, right? That was, so in many ways, it was perfectly predictable that if China could get their incentives right, and we're going to talk about that part here in a minute, but if China could do things to start the grow, that they would grow very, very rapidly because of diminishing marginal returns. In some sense, that's not a testament to how great China is. It's a testament to how poor they are or were, right? When you grow at 7 or 10%, what does that mean? It means you're likely very poor. It likely means you're very poor because rich countries are not going to grow at that rate. So, I've heard politicians, I won't call anybody out, but there have been politicians in the not this last election cycle, but the previous election cycle, saying the U.S. should be growing at the rate of China. We should be growing at 5% a year, and the fact that we're not is just a testament to our bad government policies. Okay, that is a fundamental misunderstanding of economics. Is there any way that the U.S. is going to grow at 5% a year for a sustainable period of time? No. And that's not a testament to our failure. It's a testament to our success, that we're so rich that, yes, our growth rates are going to be slower. That's just the nature of the way things are. Could we grow at 5% a year? Yeah, okay, here's my idea. You can call this one Knoop's plan for growing at 5% a year. We go and we blow up all of our capital, and we knock down all of our cities. What's going to happen? If we go back to our graph here, we'll go all the way back down to being a poor country. But what will happen? Hey, we're poor, but we're going to start to grow fast again. And then we'll grow fast. Does that sound like a good economic plan? No, it's stupid, right? It's stupid because the idea is not to grow fast. The idea is to be rich, right? It's much better to be rich and grow slow than it is to be poor and grow fast. And that's the thing that I think a lot of people just fundamentally don't understand, is that, yeah, the US is going to grow slower than a country like China or India. That is no damning statement about the US, right? That's just a simple matter of economics, right? And so China says China reports a lot of things that need to be taken with a grain of salt. Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that that's true. But all of that said, China is definitely growing faster than the United States, right? And as somebody who goes to China every other year for the last 15 years, I mean, you can see it on the ground, right? I mean, there's no doubt that China is growing much faster. But as I said, a large part of this is because that China began at a very low level, right? It's kind of the same idea as to who's going to improve the most on the second exam in this class, the person who got a B or the person who got an F? Well, the person who got an F actually has more room for improvement, right? And it's kind of the same idea, right? That if you're poor, yeah, that's not great. You don't have much capital, but the upside is that even a little bit of capital could greatly increase your economic growth rate. So what this all tells us is that really it's technology that is the most important thing for growth, because of the limits of capital and because of the limits of human capital, that we only have so many hours in a day and so many days of our life. If we do some kind of what we could call growth accounting in the US, And these numbers are very approximate because you can imagine that in practice, it's actually very, very difficult to separate these things. Like, how do you separate technology from capital? But to the extent that economists can do this, oh, shoot, I'm putting the wrong numbers. I'm sorry. If we do some growth accounting in the US, we see that about 40% can be attributed, I shouldn't say necessarily caused by, but attributed to increases in physical capital. About a 10% caused by human capital. Notice human capital is just very low. And once again, the reason is it's hard to accumulate human capital, right? It's very hard for society because it takes time, right? It takes time. So human capital actually changes relatively slowly. Actually, I don't want to say productivity there. So to the best that economists can measure this, and once again, there's a lot of how should I say, noise in these statistics. So I wouldn't treat this as a hard and died fact, but roughly, right? Roughly about half of all growth is directly attributable to technology, about 40% to physical capital, about 10% to human capital, not very much. And that, once again, that just is a reason why, as a society, it's hard to create a lot more human capital, right? It's just, it happens, but it's happened very, very slowly. So if you think about what makes a rich country rich, let's go back to our production function. You really have to think about it this way. There's really two production functions. There's a production function for the rich and for the poor. Why is the production function for the rich much higher than the poor? It's higher for the rich because they have more technology and they have human capital. So the production function of the rich is going to be higher than the production function of the poor, as I said, because of more productivity and more human capital. But there's also a third difference. That rich countries have more physical capital. Right? And so it's not just the shape of the production function, but it's where you are on this production function that determines your income level. So the rich are also higher on their production function. Because they have more physical capital. All right. So one thing that we know about economics and about growth is of those big three, right? Of those big three, it is technology and innovation that is the biggest factor. And so when you think about growth theory, and if you study growth theory, one of the things that that economists, I think, are constantly struggling with is trying to understand technology and innovation and where it's coming from. And this is one reason why economists are not very good about predicting the future. Quite honestly, is that to the extent that growth is relying upon innovation, innovation is very difficult to predict. I mean, who knows the future of innovation? And so this is a big challenge for economists who want to make predictions about the world. We want to do forecasting. But of course, so much of economic growth, particularly in a country like the US, is dependent upon innovation. And you know how quickly that innovation impacts productivity can take, it's just hard to say, right? It's just hard to say. So, you know, yeah, there's a lot more that I could say about this, but this is one of the reasons why economists are not particularly good forecasters, is that we know technology is important, but actually forecasting what's going to happen to productivity and technology and innovation in the future is a very, very dangerous game. I mean, even the smartest people are often wrong about this. Okay, so let's take a minute here because we've got about 20 minutes left in class. Let's take a minute to kind of maybe step back and review what we've talked about. We started why are rich countries rich? And we said, well, it's because they have higher productivity. Fundamentally, that's why rich countries are rich. They have higher productivity. And then we asked the question, well, why do they have higher productivity? Because they have more physical capital, human capital, technology. And of these three, we know that technology is the most important. Okay, now the next question for us is, well, why do they have more of these three things? So in other words, we have to think more fundamentally or more meta about where economic growth comes from. So let's do some meta thinking about growth. Meaning, let's get down to the fundamentals about why some countries are rich and some countries are poor. In other words, what exactly is driving some countries to have more physical capital, human capital, and technology, right? What is the core cause of that? On this, economists have a lot of insight. And it all comes down to this idea of what we call institutions. Institutions. Institutions here in an economic sense, right? An economic sense. And so I want us to be very clear about this definition, because when I use the word institutions here, I'm using it in a very specific sense. Okay. What do economists mean when they talk about institutions? We are talking about incentives. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. I forgot something. Institutions are the incentives created by governments and societies to engage in productive behavior. And not theft. Plain and simple. It's the incentives created by governments and society to engage in productive behavior and not just simple theft. To maybe think about this in another way, when economists talk about institutions, they're really asking, does your society encourage making or does it encourage taking? To the extent that society creates incentives that encourage people to make things, you're going to be richer. And the extent to which it encourages society to take things, you're going to be poor. Okay, so I want to be very clear when I'm talking about incentives here. I am not talking about good people and bad people, okay? I am not talking about some people are good and some people are evil. In fact, I'm talking about exactly the opposite. That economists basically think that everybody is the same, but we have different behaviors because we face different incentives, okay? So when you talk to an economist about history, we tend to think about history as driven by entrepreneurs. We tend to think about history as just people driven by incentives to make them and the people around them better off. So in many ways, economists don't really think that Genghis Khan and Mark Zuckerberg are fundamentally different people. They're both entrepreneurs, right? They're both entrepreneurs. So why did Genghis Khan pillage, right, the steppes and Eastern Europe in the 1300s? Why didn't he just get a little yurt, set up a small business, become a trader, right? What were the incentives for him to start this, start a Casey's on the steppes of Mongolia, right? What would have happened if he started a small business? Could he have done that? Come on, help me out. Jonah, what do you think? Do you think that Genghis Khan would have been pretty good small business owner?
I mean, I can't say for sure because I don't know the guy personally, but I think he's a leader. I mean, he got a lot of land in his time, so.
Right. So why is it that we tend to think about people from Genghis Khan's time and earlier as basically leaders of war? Because what was probably the most reliable way to make money is to engage in warfare, to take, right? I mean, the incentives for making were not really great during that period of time, right? You could set up a yurt and start your own business, but what's going to happen is that somebody's going to come along and take it all from you. And that could happen at any time. All of the incentives created by the society at that time was you get rich by taking. Now, nowadays, could Mark Zuckerberg get up on a horse and start pillaging Silicon Valley? He could, but once again, there's not that much money in that nowadays, right? And society and government has created many incentives to discourage people from doing that, right? The incentives for pillaging are much lower in Silicon Valley in 2021 than they were on the steppes of Mongolia in the 1350s, right? And that's what we're talking about here. People's behaviors reflect incentives, right? Behaviors reflect incentives. And what shapes incentives? Institutions. Institutions shape incentives, shape behaviors. I don't know why I have this moving from right and left. That looks backwards, but should have drawn it the other way. Institutions shape incentives, which shape behaviors. The failure to understand this has led to so much bad thinking, both in historical terms and otherwise, right? Like, I know for a fact that if I had to sit through your high school history class, I would probably lose my mind, because so much in many high school history classes is just simply doesn't make sense when you think about it like an economist. For instance, I know that when I took high school history, I was asked the question, well, what caused the Industrial Revolution? What were you told in high school history class about what caused the Industrial Revolution? Right? If I ask you what caused the Industrial Revolution, what did you hear? What did you hear? Surely you talked about this. Someone help me out here. Brent says the printing press. The printing press is before the Industrial Revolution, but yeah, you do hear a lot about, sure, the printing press is one of the things that made someone realized you can burn coal to make power, right? The steam engine, right? You kind of hear those kind of things, the creation of the engine, the utilization of power. Yeah, all these kind of things. That's all wrong. It's all wrong. First off, do you know that the Romans had steam engines? The Romans, 1,000 years before, had steam engines, right? The printing press existed well before the Industrial Revolution. The printing press was invented in China, right? The Industrial Revolution didn't begin until England. It began in England. It didn't reach China till, well, maybe the 1780s, or I'm sorry, the 1980s. You know, all these ideas that somehow technology caused the Industrial Revolution are just simply wrong. Most of the technologies that we think of that are associated with the Industrial Revolution existed a long time before that, right? As we're going to argue, what caused the Industrial Revolution? It was a change in institutions. It was a change in the way that society and government organized itself that created the Industrial Revolution. This is also, as we talk through this, will help us understand a lot of things about why location matters. Location matters so much because of institutions. And we have a lot of great experiments for this. Right? Think of the difference between North and South Korea. 70 years ago, North and South Korea were the same country. In fact, North Korea was a little bit richer than South Korea. What happened? A civil war. The country was divided along a completely arbitrary line, right? A completely arbitrary line. And what do we see today? South Korea is about 40 to 50 times richer than North Korea, right? The people on both sides of that line are the same people, ethnically, culturally, socially, but they have a much different set of institutions, a much different set of incentives that they face. For those of you who have traveled in the US, right, you can think about places like Nogales. Or I'm sorry, and not Texas, Arizona. Nogales is a pretty significant town in Arizona. Half of the town is in the United States and the other half is in Mexico. Where is that line? It was drawn pretty much arbitrarily back in the early 1800s, right? I think roughly. I'm trying to remember my history. When is the Gadsden Purchase? Wasn't it like 1820, something like that? I could be wrong. But anyway, you have this town where people on both sides are ethnically and culturally the same people, and you draw a line between it. What do we see today? The Arizona side is twice as rich as the Mexico side, right? The Arizona side is twice as rich as the Mexico side. What's the difference? The difference is institutions, right? It's the incentives that people face on one side of the border versus the other side of the border. So we need to talk about this in more detail. We want to talk about the things that comprise productive institutions. I want to talk about a number of things here, and we don't have time to talk about them all. Let me talk about one, and then we will pick up this discussion on Wednesday, right? And we'll finish this discussion then. But I do want to talk about one before I let you go here this morning, and that is this idea of one of the things that we see for countries that have productive institutions. Sorry, I can't write one thing and say something else. I figured this out. One of the things that we see about countries that are richer is that they have institutions that protect property rights. And property rights basically means that people can keep a large portion of their output from their own labor. Nothing else matters if property rights aren't protected to some extent. Think about that peasant in the Middle Ages. What happened if a peasant worked hard and produced a little bit more food? Where's that little bit more food go? Right to whoever owns the castle, right? The person who's living up there in that castle, right? So if you know that if you work harder or you come up with a new idea, that somebody's just going to take all the benefits from that, what's your incentive to work harder? Zero, right? And we see this problem again and again and again, is that throughout throughout world history, for the most part, there were very few property rights. In other words, people in general could not keep the output from their own labor. The only way that you did have some measure of property rights is you became the strongest and you could take more than the other person took from you, right? Which is part of the reason why war has traditionally been a very attractive form of economic activity, right? Because at least there, you can kind of protect your property rights by taking theirs before they take you. We talked a little bit about a minute ago about the Industrial Revolution. Why did the Industrial Revolution begin in the mid-1700s? Well, economists today really argue that it was not a technology that caused it, but it was an idea. The idea of individual freedom and protection of property rights. It's more about how some societies evolved around this idea of individual freedom and protecting property rights. You had things like the Declaration of Independence. In the US, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in France. In England, you had people like David Hume, Adam Smith, who were doing this work around this idea that the best society is one that protects the rights of individuals. In England, you also had the Magna Carta, right? And if you remember from world history, what was the Magna Carta? The Magna Carta, this wasn't from the mid-1700s. I think this is back from the 1200s, right? But the Magna Carta essentially was a document that said the king doesn't have all the power, right? It put a limit on government power and created some realm for individual freedom. All of these ideas fundamentally changed incentives and encouraged people to work harder, to innovate, and to produce more, right? In any economic revolution, whenever you have a growth miracle, it begins with a change in institutions. Why did China begin to grow in 1978? It was simply a change in institutions. Deng Xiaoping became president in China, and Deng Xiaoping began to open up the economy to a more market-based economy. In particular, what he did was began a system called the household responsibility system, which meant that if you were a farmer and you produced more than the quota, you got to keep the rest. So just that simple change in allowing people to keep more of the produce of their hard work led to a dramatic increase in productivity. And as more and more of China moved to a market-based economy and where property rights were protected, not in the same way that they are in the US, but in different ways, we began to see people have more and more incentive to produce as opposed to take. And so once again, it comes back to this idea of to what extent does society encourage you to make, and to what extent does it encourage you to take, right? So that's one of the ways, maybe the most fundamental way that society encourages this. When we come back and talk about this on Wednesday, I want to talk about some other, maybe not quite as important, but still fundamentally important things that shape institutions. Zach, did you have a quick question?
Yeah. So I had a question just as like productivity increases and the country becomes like more rich, does that also then lead to like larger disparities in wealth, obviously, among the people?
So it does. And yeah, we'll come back and talk about this on Wednesday when we talk about inequality. But listen, when before there was economic growth, there was also equality and poverty, largely. So yes, economic growth does tend to create inequality. Having said that, there's something different going on about the inequality that we're experiencing today, right? The inequality that we're experiencing in the US is fundamentally different today than it was in 1980, for instance. So yes, growth does create inequality, but I don't think that means that it has to create this level of inequality. Right? And so this level of inequality, well, that's a big question that we'll have to spend a lot of time talking about. I mean, what is it about today in the last 40 years that's driven inequality? But yes, and in fact, if you're curious about this question, there's an interesting book that it actually shows that during the worst periods of human history, such as during the Black Death was actually a period of growing equality. So disasters, pandemics typically have created more equality. In that sense, COVID is different than the Black Death. COVID has most likely increased inequality. The Black Death actually greatly expanded equality, which is a really interesting topic, one that's going to take us way beyond our time, so we better not talk about it. But yeah. Okay, I'm sorry, I went a little bit over. I apologize, but I'll give you those 6 minutes back this afternoon, I promise. So remember, we're just going to be reviewing for the exam. So please bring questions, bring comments, whatever you want to talk about. Basically, this afternoon's class will kind of last as long as you have something you want to talk about, okay? Okay, have a good lunch.